and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week we're going to digress a little from the usual pattern and take a hard look instead at the hits and misses of the Modi government in the economic arena as it approaches the halfway mark of its 5-year term later this month. And joining me in the discussion are two of the best macroeconomic brains in the country, Dr. C Rangarajan, who as former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and Chairman of the then Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has close to 3 decades of experience in economic policy making, and Dr. Rajiv Kumar, who like Dr. Rangarajan has worn a number of hats and is presently Senior Fellow, Centre for Policy Research, New Delhi. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rangarajan and Rajiv. Let me start by asking each of you, how would you assess the performance of the Modi government in the close to 30 months that it has been in office? Remember, I started the discussion by saying we're going to focus only on the economic arena. And though I know that any assessment of economic performance, especially in a democracy, can never be completely divorced from questions of political economy, given the constraints posed by the political system, how would you rate the performance of the Modi government? We'll get into the specifics a little later in the program, but very broadly, do you see the glass as half full or as half empty? Let me start with you, Dr. Rangarajan.
Well, looked at it from the angle of the rate of growth in the GDP. We have had a reasonable rate of growth in the last 2.5 years, even though doubts persist on the veracity of the numbers. In the world of today, a rate of growth in excess of 7% is considered to be extremely good. But then there are concerns about how well the numbers match with the ground reality. There is not enough of an enthusiasm at the ground level that things are improving as the numbers indicate. But anyway, these are the numbers that we can go by, and therefore based on those numbers one can say that has been a reasonably respectable rate of growth. One thing that is still to happen is the pickup in investment. Whatever numbers that one has seen indicates that corporate investment is not really picking up, and much of the increase in production that one may be seeing is more due to the better utilization of capacity. You mentioned about non-economic factors, but I do believe non-economic factors are also extremely important in terms of building up the investment sentiment. I think the government needs to move away from disruptive issues and focus on growth, even though they have been repeatedly saying so. Therefore, overall, the rate of growth is good, but one of the important things that is required for medium-term high growth is a pickup in investment, which is yet to happen.
Okay. Would you agree with that assessment, Rajiv? Because though Dr. Rangarajan says there does seem to be some disconnect between the GDP numbers and what's happening on the ground, he says that broadly the performance as per GDP is quite good. Would you agree with his assessment?
Completely agree, and I must say categorically that I see the glass is half full and not half empty. And let me recall, Mythili, that in August of 2013, when the rupee was in a free fall and the current account deficit was an all-time high, India was seen to be as a member of the Fragile Five, and it was one of the countries which was seen to be keeling over. I don't think anybody can now say that 3 years later, India is seen as a beacon of hope in the global economy, which is beset with all kind of turmoils and all sorts of uncertainties. And even if we accept the JP Morgan estimate that the Indian GDP has been growing at not 7.6 but 5.6%, this is very creditable in the climate that we have today. Moreover, as you know, our reserves have risen, our current account deficit is low, our fiscal deficit targets have been maintained. So on the macro sense, and most importantly, inflation, the curse for the poor people, especially food inflation, has come down. Now, not all of this can be laid at the doorstep of this government, because some things have been very fortuitous, like the decline in commodity and oil prices. But nonetheless, I should point out that this government has passed no less than 103 bills in the sort of 2.5 years it has been in office, and of which 10 bills like the GST, the bankruptcy, the Benami property, the Aadhaar bill, the sort of the Factories Amendment bill, the right for compensation, etc. There are 10 such key bills, legislations that have been passed that will change the whole, that have the potential to change the trajectory of growth going forward. Having said that, let me also agree with Dr. Rangarajan that corporate investment has not responded. It is still reeling under the uncertainties that had been created in the previous regime, and the uncertainties that are now, some of the uncertainties that are now prevailing. But most importantly, as the RBI survey points out, they are strapped with excess capacity. Excess capacity and a weak external demand means that the corporate investment has not been forthcoming. However, I have now advocated for some time that there needs to be some very sharp and very urgent thinking on how to bring about this corporate investment, because the key and the greatest priority is employment generation, which is, I'm afraid, not taking place at all the desired levels that we want it to be, and that can create a lot of problems going forward. So a glass half full, but some nagging fears which have to be addressed.
Okay. Dr. Rangarajan, Rajiv listed a number of things that the government has done. But if I were to ask you to list 3 main achievements of the Modi government in the past 2.5 years, what would they be? Would it be lower inflation, GST, the fight against black money, FDI liberalization? What would they be, the 3 main achievements to your mind?
I think there has been movement in terms of reforms. Rajiv also mentioned about the various legislations that have been introduced. I think the bankruptcy code has been passed. There is a regulator for the real estate, and the GST constitutional amendment bill has been passed, and very soon it is hoped that GST will come into operation. Therefore, there has been movement in the direction of the reforms gathering momentum. The second, of course, is the fact that there is a certain amount of stability in the system. As was pointed out, the inflation remains below 4%, around 4%. The balance of payments position, the current account deficit is low, and therefore, and the fiscal deficit is also more or less under control. Therefore, the 3 elements which constitute the stability parameters are reasonably strong. So these are, I think, the achievements. As far as was indicated, some of these are windfall. I think the control in prices is to a very large extent due also to the decline in the not only in the oil prices but certain other international commodity prices. But the fact remains that inflation remains low. So these are really some of the things that one sees happening in the last 2.5 years or more.
Dr. Rangarajan listed a number of things that the government has done, but actually many of these are really works in progress. Whether you take the fight against inflation, whether you take GST, FDI liberalization, it will be a couple of years at least before we see the benefits on the ground. So do you think the Modi government will be able to reap the benefits?
Of course, that's open to question, but I must commend the government for having taken steps to change the fundamentals of economy and economic process in the country. The Companies Amendment Bill, the Constitutional Amendment Bill for the GST, the Factories Amendment Bill, and the fact of the latest, which is the demonetization of the rupees 500 and 1000, which is a part of their fight against the black money, which is a menace, which is a cancer that has been gnawing, that's been eroding the entrails of this economy. I think those are some of those amazing steps and I'm using the word advisedly, which will change the trajectory and the nature and character of not just the economy but our social fabric, and which is why I've been such a strong supporter of this latest move despite its implementational fault due to some bureaucratic bungling, if you like. But apart from this legislative activity, which is fundamental to taking the Indian economy in a different direction and helping it hopefully get over the middle income trap in future, I think also we must point out to the fact that the government has given a huge focus on improving the governance in the system. They inherited, I'm afraid, a broken governance system. This government has been hell-bent, if you like, on improving the administrative governance. They should have also taken some administrative reforms, but I think they didn't want to upset that apple cart or disturb that hornet bee's nest. But nonetheless, the governance and decision making has improved. And the third thing is that they have taken very concrete steps to improve the infrastructure of the country, whether it's electricity, highways or ports. All of this, will the Modi government benefit? I hope they do, because they deserve it. And I hope therefore that the economy, the investment cycle especially, will turn upwards in the next 2 years, 2017 or 18, which will be very well timed for them, for the political cycle that is coming to them in 2019. So yes, there is a gestation period, but some of the steps that they have taken, including the ease of doing business, and I don't know why I forgot to mention that, because the earlier governments never took that seriously. They just poo-pooed it. They've taken it seriously. They've started a process of competitive good governance among the states, and they've got the states on board, as you just saw by the release of the last rankings. I think it will yield benefit to the Modi government, and the economic cycle will hopefully synchronize with the political cycle in its upward phase as we go into the next general elections.
Okay, so you hope that the Modi government will be able to reap the benefit. One can never be very sure, but I'm afraid on that note, it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the achievements, the hits and misses of the Modi government in the economic arena as they approach their halfway mark of their tenure. Dr. Rangarajan, before the break, Rajiv was talking about how he hoped that the government would be able to reap the benefits, because many of the steps they have taken are necessary improvement of the plumbing, as it were, of the economy. But one of the problems with pursuing economic reforms, especially in a democratic polity, is that though the pain is usually immediate, the rewards often come much later, maybe in the tenure of the next government also. While this choice is most stark in the context of monetary policy, which you're familiar with, where political interests often dictate pursuit of a loose monetary policy, even as economic interests might suggest something quite different, can governments in a democracy really afford to take a long-term view? And specifically in the context of the Modi government, have they shown the necessary political courage needed for a long-term view? And will they pay the price for it, Dr. Rangarajan?
Well, I must also say that the present government is also a beneficiary of many of the steps taken by the previous government. One talked about the improvement in the balance of payments, but the improvement in the balance of payments started after the 2014 itself. Therefore, and also the decline in prices also began in the period of the earlier government. Therefore, in some sense, it is very difficult to compartmentalize, but the benefits of what the previous government have done have also come to the present government. Therefore, in some ways, the credit goes as much to the previous government on some of those initiatives. For example, GST, of course, is a long drawn battle. It originated many years ago, and it had gone through many difficult periods. Finally, it has settled now. Therefore, but it cannot be simply said that the entire idea was new or was generated by this government. Therefore, governments do benefit from what the previous governments have done, and I do think that this government has also benefited by many of the actions taken by the previous government. As far as the fundamental question is concerned, I think democracy has this problem. When elections are being held once in 5 years, one has to match the short-term requirements of the political system with the long-term policies that are needed. Therefore, in some sense, whatever measures that have been taken in terms of the reform agenda will have a longer term impact, and those measures are in the right direction. I think that is important to note.
Would you agree with me that, Rajiv, that it's actually very difficult to draw a line in the sand? And in a country, what matters is that the country should benefit. Because the fact is that the Modi government has picked its battles very carefully. For instance, in the case of the land acquisition bill, it opted to back off rather than ram its view through. I know you will tell me that they had no choice given the lack of numbers in the Rajya Sabha. And that is true to some extent. But wherever the government felt the stakes were high enough, as in the case of the GST or Aadhaar, it has found ways to square the circle, as it were. So is it that the Modi government has been very wise, quote unquote, in choosing its battles?
Yes, of course. I think Mr. Modi is, if you like, characterized by his pragmatism, by his ear very close to the ground. And you're right, he, I think, is a believer in, despite all the legislation and now this heroic attempt at demonetization, I had thought he was an incrementalist and not ones who went for the headlines. And I was quite happy with it because, as you said yourself, if the plumbing was fixed, the building would stop leaking, and then and then things would be better. So he has chosen his political battles, correctly, and he has also seen what are the what is the people's sort of expectation of him. Now, my only sort of one comment is that there are also the legacy issues which have constrained him in some sense, in taking some other decisions, and he has to live with those legacies as well. And governance at the central government, interministerial coordination, intergovernment coordination is so awfully lacking in our country that that the gestation periods for all our projects, which, as you know, more than 600 projects have been have been in comatose stage before he'll act. The NPAs that he has inherited has been due to the sort of the huge lending that was done by the banks in the earlier years. So he has taken a pragmatic view, but starting with this demonetization and the GST, I think he is now also going towards some structural reforms which will have long-term positive implications for the economy. Now, my only plea to Mr. Modi has been and continues to be that please focus on employment generation like a laser, because that is one aspect which can bring the whole apple cart down, and that is not yet being addressed as much as it should be. And I hope he will do that in the coming years, in the coming months, actually.
Dr. Rangarajan, we spent a long time talking about what the government has done, but now can we turn to the areas where it has fallen short? What are the three big areas where you think it hasn't done enough? Would it be labour reform, judicial reform? What are the areas that you can think of where the government could clearly do more and should do more?
Well, in a sense that as far as the reforms are concerned, there are many areas which continue to be or which need to be addressed. There is progress, as I said, there has been a movement. But there are other areas, I find some segments where pre-1991 type of controls continue to operate. A good example is the sugar industry, the other is the fertilizer production and so on. Therefore, we really need to see where the competitive element is lacking, and we need to progress in the direction of creating a more competitive environment in all segments of the economy. Therefore, that is a general principle. When you ask about the failures, I actually go back to what I mentioned in the beginning about the non-economic factors. I am a bit concerned about it because I think while on the one hand, much of the talk is on growth, much of the talk is on pushing the economy forward and so on. But there are other things that are happening in the system which really affect the overall sentiment. I think I don't want to list them, but there are many, many issues that are dividing the society rather than creating a convergent system. So those have to be taken account. And therefore, one of the other things that we mentioned, and Rajiv also mentioned, about the inability to increase the total level of investment in the economy. Actually, the investment rate and the gross fixed capital formation rate is coming down. And for a long term or a medium term faster growth, investment is very much needed. And that will come as a result of many actions that have been taken, but it will also come only when the investors are fully confident that we are focused only on growth and not on other issues.
Okay. Rajiv, would you like to add to that list? I know you mentioned employment creation, which is very important. And Dr. Rangarajan also told us about non-economic factors. So even though this discussion, I was trying to narrow it down to the economic arena. Do you think these non-economic factors are sufficiently important as to impede economic growth? Rajiv?
Yes, of course they are important. And I have been saying always that they are important, especially because India is probably the only country in the history, as it were, which has decided to undertake its three transitions, the social, economic and political simultaneously. And therefore, all the three affect each other, and therefore you can't lag behind or you can't neglect one at the cost of, neglecting, except at the cost of neglecting the other. So they are critical. And let me therefore mention in that light the three that I think are very important. The first one, I think, is the lack of ability to create a broader coalition for reforms and progress and getting India forward. By that I mean, and I was glad to see that on July 10 the Prime Minister did convene the first meeting after 10 years of the Interstate Council. I think the coordination and coalition building with the states and the centre needs much more doing than what we have been doing so far. Without that, we cannot take forward. The action is shifted to the state capitals, and New Delhi must recognize that. Second is the judicial reforms. There is a sclerosis in our system, in our economy. Contract enforcement is woeful. It takes 10 years for people to close down their businesses, principally because the judiciary will not do their bit. The judiciary has to be reformed. The pendency of the cases of, I think, 4 million cases or some 40 million cases is just awful. And I think judicial reforms are required. The government should nudge them in that direction. And so that's the second one. And the third one that I wanted to mention was structural administrative reforms, because the Prime Minister apparently is a follower or believes in establishing a development state a la East Asia, and which is what it should be, to replace the soft state that we have had. But a development state cannot happen unless the bureaucracy has the right incentive structure to deliver and perform, and which it will not do under the current systems of incentives and disincentives that we have. To expect that one individual, the Prime Minister or some other minister, can drive the bureaucracy to greater performance without changing the fundamental nature of that, I think is wrong. So there's time, therefore, that all the administrative reform, wonderful done by the Moily Committee, should now be looked into and the administrative reforms be undertaken.
Absolutely, Rajiv. You touch a very raw nerve, the state of the bureaucracy in the country and the rot that it is there. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition, so we'll have to end this discussion. Clearly, despite doing a great deal, the Modi government still has a great deal more to do. But that perhaps is inevitable in a complex democracy like ours. But to the extent that well begun is half done, I think the government has something creditable to show on its report card so far. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan and Rajiv, for joining me in this discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at @etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.